December 29th, 1610. The Kingdom of Hungary is buried in snow. A column of riders climbs the hill toward Chaktice Castle in the dark. Torches guttering low, breath freezing white in the air, hooves cracking through ice on the road. At the front rides György Thurzó, the second most powerful man in the kingdom, and he has sent no word ahead. He wants the element of surprise. He believes that if the woman inside learns he is coming, whatever he finds will already be gone, hidden, buried, denied. What his men find inside those walls will be retold, rewritten, and exaggerated for the next 400 years. A girl, dead, another dying. Others locked away somewhere in the dark of that castle, starved, marked with wounds no accident could explain. And at the center of it, the lady of the castle herself, Elizabeth Báthory, Countess, widow, one of the richest women in Europe, about to become, in the words history would eventually attach to her name, the most prolific female serial killer who ever lived. 650 victims. That's the number. It's sat in a world record book as settled fact for decades, and it might not be real at all. Welcome to Bone and Crown, where we don't just tell you the legend. We open the case file. You've probably heard some version of her story already. The Countess who bathed in the blood of murdered virgins to stay young forever. It's one of the most famous horror legends to ever come out of Eastern Europe. Whispered about in dorm rooms, dramatized in films, and yes, still sitting in that record book today. Here's the problem. Almost none of it is true, at least not in the way you've heard it. What actually happened at Chaktice is, in some ways, darker than the legend. In other ways, it's far more complicated. It involves real girls who really died. It also involves a king who owed a fortune he had no intention of repaying, a rival noble with ambitions of his own, and a trial where the single most famous detail of the entire case, the blood, the bathtub, all of it, doesn't appear anywhere in the actual surviving evidence. So tonight, we go back to Hungary, 1610, to separate what's fact from what's 400-year-old fan fiction, and to ask why the true answer might be more disturbing than the myth ever was. One warning before we start. This is a story about the abuse of children and young women who had almost no power to protect themselves. We are not going to look away from that, but we are also not going to invent horrors the evidence doesn't support. Because the real victims in this story deserve the truth, not a better legend. On this channel, we chase the paper trail, not the campfire story. And this might be the hardest case yet to pin down, because almost everything we think we know about this woman was written by people who weren't even born yet when she died. Let's begin. To understand what happened to Elizabeth Báthory, you first have to understand what it meant to be born a Bathory in the first place. This was not an ordinary noble family. This was one of the most powerful bloodlines in Eastern Europe. A family that didn't just attend royal courts, it filled them. Elizabeth's own cousin, Stephen Bathory, sat on the throne of Poland and Lithuania during her lifetime. Other relatives ruled Transylvania outright. When people said the name Bathory in 1560s Hungary, they weren't describing a wealthy family. They were describing a family that made kings, broke kings, and answered to almost nobody. She was born in 1560, likely at the family estate in Nyírbátor. One detail is worth pausing on. The Bathory coat of arms featured 3 wolf's teeth encircled by a dragon biting its own tail. That dragon marked the family's membership in the Order of the Dragon, a chivalric brotherhood founded in 1408 to defend Christian Europe against the Ottomans. A generation earlier, the same order counted among its members a Wallachian nobleman named Vlad Dracul, son of the dragon, whose own son would later be remembered by a more familiar name, Vlad the Impaler. Two family crests, two dragons, two legends that would each get dragged into vampire fiction centuries later for completely unrelated reasons. It's a coincidence, but it's the kind of coincidence storytellers couldn't resist, and almost from the beginning, rumors about the Bathory family follow a strange, unsettling pattern. Cousins whispered to have dabbled in alchemy. An uncle remembered for a cruelty that unsettled people who were themselves no strangers to violence. Elizabeth herself reportedly suffered seizures as a child, sometimes alongside sudden fits of rage. Epilepsy? Something else? Nobody can say for certain. It's the kind of detail historians can't confirm, and can never quite let go of either. What we can confirm is this: Elizabeth Báthory was clever, remarkably, dangerously clever. She read and wrote fluently in Hungarian, German, and Latin at a time when plenty of noblemen, including her own future husband, could not. This was not a woman anyone could easily fool, manage, or quietly control. At 11, she was engaged to Ferenc Nadasdy, heir to one of Hungary's other great noble houses. There's a persistent rumor, never confirmed, that as a teenager, Elizabeth became pregnant by a man of lower status, and that the family quietly buried the scandal to protect the engagement. True or not, it tells you something about how this family operated. Inconvenient truths did not survive contact with Bathory money. She married Ferenc in 1575 at 14 or 15. And notice what that tells you about the balance of power in that marriage. Ferenc didn't ask Elizabeth to take his name. He took hers. He became Ferenc Nadasdy de Bathory because marrying into her family was worth infinitely more than keeping his own name intact. For the next 30 years, Elizabeth Báthory would be, for all practical purposes, the more powerful person in her own household, a fact that mattered enormously for everything that came after. Ferenc Nadasdy was, by every surviving account, a legitimately frightening man, and in his world, that was a compliment, not a warning. He made his name fighting the Ottoman Empire in Hungary's brutal, grinding border wars. Soldiers and enemies alike called him the Black Bey, the Black Knight of Hungary. Stories followed him home from every campaign, trophies collected from dead enemies, battlefield cruelty his own side treated as a badge of honor rather than a crime. In his world, terrifying your enemy wasn't a war crime. It was a resume line. Because Ferenc spent so much of the marriage away fighting, it was Elizabeth who actually ran things. Not one estate, a network of them. Chaktic Castle, her primary residence, a wedding gift from her formidable mother-in-law, Sarvar, Leka, Kerestur, Bekov. Land stretching across a meaningful portion of the kingdom, worked by hundreds of serfs, guarded by her own private soldiers. Think about what that means. A noble woman in 1600s Hungary wasn't a landlord in the modern sense. She was the law on that property. She settled disputes. She decided punishments. And corporal punishment of servants wasn't just tolerated in this era. It was completely legal standard practice across the European nobility. Hold on to that, because it matters for everything that comes next. The line between a noblewoman disciplining her staff and a noblewoman committing a crime was drawn much further toward cruelty in 1600s Hungary than it would be drawn today. Later legend claims Ferenc personally taught Elizabeth torture methods from his campaigns, even describing a supposed device called an iron virgin, a spiked cabinet meant to crush and impale anyone locked inside. It sounds like something from a horror film because it essentially is one. That device doesn't trace back to a single contemporary document. It shows up centuries later in writers looking to give Elizabeth's story an origin. What we can say more cautiously is that the Báthory household had a local reputation for severity, even in an era where severity toward servants was already the norm. Elizabeth and Ferenc had 5 children, though only 3 survived to adulthood. Anna, born 1585, Orsolya, who died around age 6 of an untreated dental infection, a son, Andras, who died in infancy, Catalin, born 1594, and Paul, born 1598, who would eventually inherit what remained of the family's titles. Whether the household's cruel reputation traced back to Elizabeth, to Ferenc, to her formidable mother-in-law Orsolya Canise, or simply to ordinary noble brutality inflated by village gossip, the surviving record can't fully untangle it. In January 1604, Ferenc died from an illness some accounts trace back to a wound that never healed. He was around 48. Elizabeth was in her mid-40s, a widow, fantastically wealthy, and for the first time since she was 14 years old, answerable to absolutely no one. Choctich Castle sat on a steep hill above the village, its stone walls visible for miles, a constant reminder of exactly where power in the region lived. Inside, Elizabeth ran a household with almost no one left who could tell her no. Her children were grown, married, building lives away from Choctiche. Her husband's soldiers and allies had scattered. What remained was a household run entirely on her authority in a remote castle, far from the oversight of any court. According to everything that would be alleged 6 years later, that is exactly when things began to change. Something dark began accumulating around Choctich Castle. Slowly, quietly, the way rumors accumulate in places where the person at the center of them holds absolute power over everyone who might otherwise speak up. Peasant girls, daughters of local farmers, sent to the castle to earn money as maids, began disappearing or dying. A girl would leave for Choctiche in good health and simply never come home, and the explanation offered to her family would be vague. Fever, an accident, a sudden illness. The kind of explanation a grieving farmer had no power to question. Let's deal with the number you've probably already heard, because it's the single most repeated fact about this entire case. 650 victims. It's the number that eventually landed Elizabeth Báthory in the Guinness Book of World Records as history's most prolific female serial killer. That number traces back to exactly one place, a single secondhand claim. One witness told investigators that a court official had supposedly seen a private ledger listing 650 names. That ledger has never been found. Not by investigators in 1611, not by a single historian in the 4 centuries since. Not one of the 289 other people interviewed corroborates it. It is hearsay about a document nobody has ever produced, repeated by someone who never claimed to have seen it themselves. So what does the actual first-hand testimony say? Servants who admitted to helping bury bodies described numbers between roughly 3 dozen and just over 50, spread across several years. That is still an appalling, deeply documented number, if true. It is not 650. It isn't even a tenth of that. And of those 289 witnesses, more than 250 offered nothing but hearsay. I heard that? People in the village say. Several of the most damning specific confessions, the ones that came from Elizabeth's own servants, were extracted under torture, which reliably produces exactly the kind of statement a suffering person believes their interrogator wants to hear. None of this means nothing happened at Chaktichi. It means the actual scale is hotly disputed by serious historians. In a way, the popular 650 version completely erases, and the crimes weren't confined to one castle. Testimony places the abuse across several of Elizabeth's properties, from Chaktik to Sarvar, to residences as far as Vienna. This wasn't one household with one dark secret. If the accusations are accurate, it was a pattern that traveled with her for years. Most of what investigators gathered was secondhand, but not all of it. Two court officials, Benedek Deseo and Jakob Silvasi, swore under oath they had personally witnessed Elizabeth torture and kill servant girls with their own eyes. Deseo testified that he saw her seize a shoemaker's daughter, a girl the record names only as Ilonka, strip her, and cut into her arms with a knife, starting at the fingers and working upward. It's one of the only pieces of testimony in this case that comes from a direct, named eyewitness rather than rumor or a tortured confession, part of why most historians don't believe this was invented from nothing. And yet, even the hard numbers contradict each other. Benedek Bixerdi, the castellan who managed the Sarvar estate, told investigators in October 1610 that he personally believed at least 175 girls and women had died at that single property alone. It's higher than the servants' burial count, lower than the mythical ledger, and impossible to verify either way. That, maybe more than anything, tells you how murky the actual truth here really is. Before we go further, if you're new here, this is Bone and Crown, and every week we take a true crime or dark history story and dig into what the evidence actually supports. If that's your kind of thing, subscribing helps us keep telling these stories properly. All right, back to Hungary. This is the detail that changes everything about how this case actually unfolded. And it's a detail most retellings skip entirely. For years, the dead and missing girls at Chaktiche were peasants, farmers' daughters. And in the value system of 1600s Hungary, that meant almost nobody with real power cared enough to act. A noble mistreating her own servants, even to the point of death, was the kind of scandal a village pastor might whisper about from his pulpit. It didn't reach a king's court. Then, around 1609, something shifted. Elizabeth reportedly began accepting a new kind of girl into her household. Not peasants this time, but daughters of impoverished minor nobility, sent to Chaktiche to be tutored in etiquette and refinement, the social graces a young noblewoman needed to make a good marriage. On paper, it looked almost generous. If the accusations are accurate, some of these girls met the exact same fate as the servants before them. And unlike peasant families, minor noble families had standing. They had connections. They had a legal system actually built, in theory, to listen when they complained. It is not a coincidence, most historians agree on this, that the investigation gained real momentum only once rumors began involving noble blood, not peasant blood. The crown could absorb a great deal of cruelty toward the servant class before feeling pressured to intervene. Cruelty toward their own class was a different problem entirely. Sit with that, because it cuts two ways. It suggests something authentically dangerous was happening inside that castle. Dangerous enough that it took the suffering of higher status girls to finally force anyone into action, which is itself a quiet, ugly indictment of how little peasant lives counted for. And at the same moment, it hands real ammunition to the theory that this was, at least partly, political, because the trigger for royal action wasn't a sudden moral awakening. It was a threat to families the crown could no longer afford to ignore, at a moment when acting on it happened to be extraordinarily convenient for everyone with power in the room. Which brings us to the men who turned that convenience into a plan. The investigation into Elizabeth Báthory did not begin because some tireless official noticed a pattern and demanded justice. It began because several powerful men, each with something to personally gain, arrived at the same conclusion at roughly the same time. Credit for first raising the alarm publicly usually goes to a local Lutheran pastor, István Magyari, who denounced what was happening at the castle from his own pulpit at genuine personal risk. Word eventually reached the royal court of King Matthias II, crowned only 2 years earlier and still very much consolidating his grip on the throne. And here is where the politics become impossible to separate from the crime. King Matthias owed Elizabeth Báthory an enormous amount of money. Some estimates place the debt above 17,000 thalers, possibly considerably higher. Not pocket change, enough to make a king very motivated to see her convicted. Money the crown had never repaid and had no intention of ever repaying. If Elizabeth were convicted of a capital crime, everything changed at once. Her network of estates, more than 20 castles and manors, would be forfeited directly to the crown. A conviction didn't just punish a crime, it erased a royal debt and delivered a fortune in confiscated property in a single stroke. The man assigned to investigate and ultimately arrest Elizabeth Báthory was György Thurzó, the Palatine of Hungary, the highest-ranking noble office beneath the king himself. Thurzó was not a neutral investigator. He was closely allied with King Matthias and had his own ambitions for his family, including hopes that his son might rise to power in Transylvania, a region where the Báthory family's continuing influence was a direct obstacle. Layer on top of that the religious tension of the era. The Báthorys were Protestant at a moment when the Catholic Habsburg monarchy had every reason to weaken independent Protestant nobles. None of this proves Elizabeth was innocent of everything she was accused of. But every single man who investigated her, arrested her, and decided her fate stood to gain, financially, politically, or both, from her being found guilty on as large a scale as possible. That's not a footnote to this story. That's the engine driving it. And it's exactly the detail that got quietly erased once the vampire legend took over. Because a monster caught red-handed makes a cleaner story than one where the judges were financially compromised from the start. Which brings us back to where we started, December 29th, 1610. Snow, torchlight. Thurzó's men climbing the hill toward Chactich Castle in the dark, with no warning sent ahead. Thurzó would later justify the surprise timing as necessary. Catch her before she could hide the evidence, before word could reach her that the crown was finally moving. And the betrayal gets more personal still. Thurzó didn't get into that castle alone. According to the record, he had help from inside Elizabeth's own family. Her son-in-law, Count Miklos Zrínyi, married to her daughter Anna, allowed his own household servants to assist Thurzó's men in gaining entry that night. Whatever loyalty marriage was supposed to buy her, it didn't hold. What his men claimed to find inside those walls has been retold and exaggerated for 4 centuries. So it's worth being careful about what the earliest sources actually describe versus what got bolted on later. The consistent core across the earliest accounts one girl found dead, another dying from her injuries. Several more discovered inside the castle, held in conditions of confinement, malnourishment, and visible abuse. Later, far less reliable versions expand this into dungeons stacked with bodies and torture devices on display. Imagery that owes far more to 18th and 19th century Gothic horror writing than to the comparatively restrained language of the surviving depositions. Picture the scene. Soldiers moving room to room by torchlight through a castle they didn't know, in the dead of a Hungarian winter, uncertain what they'd find behind the next door. Somewhere in that darkness was a woman who by morning would go from being one of the most powerful nobles in the kingdom to a prisoner in her own home, with no way of knowing yet that she would never leave it again. Whatever the precise scene actually looked like, it was enough. Combined with 6 years of accumulated rumor, and finally the political will to act, it was enough to justify Elizabeth's immediate arrest and to unleash a full investigation, dragging witnesses in from every village for miles around. 4 of her servants were arrested alongside her. Dorothea Countess and Ilona Jo, older women who worked as caretakers or nursemaids, accused of directly assisting in torture and killing. Janos Uivari, nicknamed Fichko, a manservant accused of similar involvement, including disposing of bodies, and Katerina Benica, a washerwoman, accused of a lesser role. These 4 would face a public trial. Elizabeth Báthory would not. It's worth zooming out for a moment before we go inside that courtroom, because none of this happened in a vacuum. This was an era when torture extracted confessions, coerced testimony, and prosecutions built almost entirely on rumor and social status were not unusual. They were the norm. Across Europe at roughly this same period, tens of thousands of people, overwhelmingly women, were being tried and executed in witch trials built on precisely this kind of evidence. Elizabeth Báthory's prosecution wasn't a strange exception to how justice worked in 1611. It followed the exact same playbook the era already used against inconvenient women, just aimed at a target wealthy enough to make the playbook unusually profitable. One of the strangest, most legally revealing facts in the entire case is this: the woman at the center of it all was never formally tried, not once, in any open court. Her 4 servants were tried across 2 sessions in January 1611 in the town of Bitcha. 13 witnesses testified in the first session alone, alongside the 4 defendants themselves. And what came out of those sessions is hard to listen to. Ilona Jo, who had reportedly served as Elizabeth's own childhood nurse decades earlier, confessed to helping kill approximately 50 girls. She described taking red-hot iron pokers from the fire and forcing them into a girl's mouth, or up her nose. She testified that Elizabeth herself, on at least one occasion, forced her fingers into a girl's mouth and pulled until the sides tore open. Other testimony described victims bound with Viennese cord and beaten until their bodies turned black. One girl reportedly suffering more than 200 blows before she died. Testimony also described forced exposure to freezing cold, starvation, and biting. It's worth pausing on something important: the specific, repeated details that surface across multiple separate witnesses. The cold, the burning, the beating, told in strikingly similar terms by people with no obvious reason to coordinate, are a significant part of why even skeptical historians believe something truly severe happened inside that household. At the same time, remember what interrogation looked like in 1611. Confessions extracted after days of the defendant's own torture are exactly the kind of testimony modern courts would treat as unreliable, not because nothing happened, but because torture reliably produces confession, whether or not it's true. 3 of the 4 servants were found guilty and executed immediately. Fichko was beheaded, his body burned, by the standard of what came next for the others, almost a mercy. Dorja Sentes and Ilona Jo had their fingers torn out with tongs before being burned alive. A punishment designed to declare publicly, these hands did this. Katarina Benica, judged to have played a smaller role, was sentenced to life in prison instead, and Elizabeth, because of her rank, and because a public trial of a Bathory threatened to embarrass a crown that still needed the cooperation of powerful noble families, King Matthias and Thurzo arranged something else entirely. Her own children negotiated a private deal, permanent house arrest at Chaktica, no public trial, no public verdict ever. And quietly, almost as an afterthought, the crown's outstanding debt to her was written off completely. She spent the last 3.5 years of her life sealed inside a set of rooms in her own castle, with small openings left only for food and air. No real human contact beyond the guards who fed her. She died on August 21st, 1614, around 54 years old, buried, most accounts agree, first at the church in Chaktic, though local resentment reportedly forced a later reburial. Even her final resting place is disputed today. Historians have a precise word for what happened to her. She was immured, meaning sealed alive inside a solid structure rather than executed outright. That word choice carried particular symbolic weight in this period. It wasn't only a punishment. It was a way of erasing someone from the world of the living while technically keeping them alive, denying them the public spectacle of an execution, and denying them any further voice in their own story. Every version of this story that followed, Tarazzi's, the pulp novels, the films, was written entirely by other people because the one person who could have answered back was bricked into silence 3.5 years before she finally died. The consequences of Chaktice didn't end with Elizabeth's death sealed inside her own walls. They followed her bloodline for another generation. Her surviving children, Anna, Catalin, and Paul, inherited what remained of the family's fortune under the terms of her will, drawn up in July 1614, weeks before she died. But the Nadesti Bathory name never fully recovered its former standing. Within decades, descendants were effectively pushed out of Hungary and relocated to Poland. Even after some returned in 1640, the family's noble prominence never returned with them. In one of history's stranger closing ironies, Elizabeth's own grandson, Paul's son, Ferenc Nadasti III, grew up to join a noble conspiracy against the Habsburg crown itself, the same crown that had destroyed his grandmother's freedom 2 generations earlier. It didn't end well for him either. Arrested, convicted of treason, and executed in 1671. 2 generations, 2 Nadastas, both destroyed by the same royal house. Chaktic Castle didn't fare much better than the family name. Damaged, abandoned, and left to the weather, it now stands as a roofless ruin above the village, a genuine tourist site in modern Slovakia, walked through by visitors whom local guides will tell in hushed tones once held a monster. Whether that's the documented truth or the version Tarazzi invented a century later is a question the castle itself can no longer answer. Now, the story you actually know comes from somewhere very specific, and it isn't where you'd expect. If you'd heard of Elizabeth Báthory before tonight, odds are what you'd heard was this she bathed in the blood of murdered virgins to stay forever young. It's the single most famous detail attached to her name, more famous than any fact we've actually covered tonight, and it appears nowhere in the trial testimony, not in a single witness statement, not in a single confession. 0 mentions out of 289 witnesses. The claim shows up in print for the first time in 1729 in a book called Tragica Historia, written by a Jesuit scholar named Laszlo Turoczi. That's 115 years after Elizabeth died, roughly the same gap as if the first written account of a Civil War atrocity had waited until 1980 to be published. It was the first account aimed at general readers, and it already blends real trial elements with a century of accumulated folklore. The bloodbathing detail appears to originate with Turoczi himself, or the legends he drew from, not the actual 1611 investigation. When the real witness testimonies were finally rediscovered and published in 1817, 88 years later, they contained not one reference to bloodbaths. The correction arrived far too late. The legend already belonged to everyone, so why did this specific myth take hold? Historians studying the case, notably Radu Florescu and Raymond McNally, the same researchers who dug into the historical figure behind the Dracula legend, argue part of the answer is gendered. A woman merely guilty of cruelty toward her servants apparently wasn't a dramatic enough villain for 18th century readers. Give her a motive rooted in vanity and a ritual dripping in blood, and suddenly she fits a role folklore already had waiting. The vain, blood-hungry female monster, closer to a fairy tale witch than an actual criminal defendant. Notice the uncomfortable part. The real documented crimes, the beatings, the burns, the freezing, the starvation, are horrifying enough on their own. The invented bloodbath didn't need to exist to make this story dark. It got added because it sold better. And for nearly 300 years, that's meant the actual victims have been quietly erased by their own legend. For most of the last 300 years, this case got treated as Gothic legend wearing a real woman's name, retold in film and pulp fiction far more often than studied in an archive. That started to change with researchers willing to go back to the original Hungarian and Latin court documents, instead of recycling Turoczi's version or the horror fiction it inspired. The most significant of these is American researcher and attorney Kimberly Craft, whose translations of the actual trial depositions brought a level of primary source rigor to this case that hadn't existed in English before. That research is why 650 now gets flagged as unverifiable hearsay instead of settled fact. Why the bloodbath gets correctly identified as an 18th century literary invention. And why the politics, the debt, the ambition, the religious tension get treated as central to this case instead of a footnote to a satisfying monster story. It's part of a broader pattern of historians re-examining nearly every larger-than-life villain from this period. Elizabeth Báthory just happens to be one of the most extreme examples of the gap between legend and record. We're back to the question we opened with, and the honest answer is this. Historians are deeply split, and the responsible thing to do is admit that plainly, instead of picking whichever version feels most satisfying to tell. One camp argues she really was guilty of serious, sustained abuse and killing, that a woman with near total power over the young women in her household, unaccountable for years at a stretch, committed real repeated violence against them, consistent across dozens of witnesses who never coordinated their stories. A second camp argues the entire prosecution was substantially a political and financial setup, that Elizabeth's wealth, her land, and the crown's own debt to her made her a target regardless of what happened inside those walls. And that testimony, built largely from hearsay and torture, can't establish the truth at anything close to the claimed scale. A third position, probably the most historically responsible one available, sits between the two. Some level of real severe abuse very likely happened, consistent with, if considerably worse than, the broadly brutal treatment of servants common among the nobility of this era. And that genuine wrongdoing was then seized on, amplified, and weaponized by men with obvious financial and political motives, who turned a real crime into the most profitable scandal available to them at exactly the right political moment. Under that reading, Elizabeth Báthory is both a perpetrator and, in a strange and uncomfortable way, a victim of the same event. Someone who likely did real harm, prosecuted not because the crown suddenly developed a conscience, but because her downfall was worth a forgiven fortune and a rival's ambition combined. That's a much harder story to sell than a vampire countess and a bathtub full of blood. As far as the evidence lets anyone say responsibly, it's also the one closest to the truth. Elizabeth Báthory entered popular culture almost the moment Tarashi's book hit print in 1729, and she has never really left it since. Novels, films, metal albums, video games, almost all leaning on the bloodbath imagery rather than the messier documented history underneath. She's been played on screen as a literal vampire in 1971's Countess Dracula, reimagined as a tragic Gothic figure in 2009's The Countess, and referenced in horror and metal music for decades, nearly always as the bloodbathing seductress Taroxi's book created, almost never as the far more complicated historical widow the trial record actually describes. The Guinness World Records entry crediting her as history's most prolific female serial killer, built entirely on that 650 number, remains one of the most repeated facts about her, despite resting on hearsay about a document that has never once been produced by anyone in 400 years. It's a remarkable example of how one unverified claim, repeated confidently enough across 3 centuries, hardens permanently into accepted history. And what gets buried underneath all of it, almost every single time, are the people who actually lived and died in this story. Dorothea Sentes, Ilona Yo, Janos Uivari, Katarina Benica, the 4 who stood trial and either died for it or spent the rest of their lives imprisoned for it. And the girls whose names barely survive at all, peasants and minor gentlewomen, sent to a castle to earn a wage or learn how to be a lady, who, if the more careful reading of the evidence is right, numbered in the dozens rather than the hundreds, and whose deaths became, 400 years later, less a matter of justice and more a legend about a countess and her bath. So the next time you hear someone repeat the 650 number, or describe a bathtub full of blood as documented fact, you'll know where that version of the story actually came from. Not a courtroom, a book written 115 years after she was already dead, by a man who never met her, telling the story he thought would sell. Remember the number from the top of this episode, 650, sitting in a record book as settled fact. The real evidence-based number is a fraction of that. And it's still an appalling, deeply documented body count on its own. Legends grow bigger than reality. The truth barely needs the exaggeration. That's it for this one. If this is your first time here, welcome to Bone and Crown. We'll be back soon with another story from history's darker corners. Thank you for listening. Before we go, let's slow down on a few words from tonight's episode. Because if part of why you're here is to sharpen your English while you get your dark history fix, this next part is built just for you. Today, you learned. We used the word hearsay tonight more than once. Hearsay means information you heard from someone else, not something you actually witnessed or know for certain is true. Remember, it is hearsay about a document nobody has ever produced, repeated by someone who never claimed to have seen it themselves. That's exactly what happened with the 650 number. Closely related is corroborate, a verb meaning to support or confirm something with additional evidence. We said not one of the 289 other people interviewed corroborates it. No corroboration, no proof. Then there's castellan, a noun for the official put in charge of managing and defending a castle. You heard it when we introduced Benedek Biserdi, the castellan who managed the Sarvar estate. Close to that title is palatine, a very high-ranking royal official governing with authority almost equal to the king's. That was György Thurzó's actual title, the Palatine of Hungary, the highest-ranking noble office beneath the king himself. We also used coerced, an adjective for something forced through pressure or threats, rather than done freely. Like the torture-extracted confessions, coerced testimony we talked about from the witch trials of that same era. Then confiscated, meaning officially taken away by an authority, usually as a punishment. That's what happened to Elizabeth's estates. A fortune in confiscated property in a single stroke. A more advanced one, unaccountable. It means not required to explain your actions to anyone. We used it to describe Elizabeth herself, unaccountable for years at a stretch. Then the word tied directly to tonight's title, immured. It means sealed alive inside a wall or a closed room, unable to leave. That's the precise word historians use for what happened to her. She was immured, sealed alive inside a solid structure, rather than executed outright. We also used prolific, an adjective for producing something, often something negative, in extremely large numbers. That's the exact label history gave her. The most prolific female serial killer who ever lived. And finally, consolidate, a verb meaning to make a position of power stronger and more secure. That's exactly what King Matthias was doing. Still very much consolidating his grip on the throne. 10 words: hearsay, corroborate, castellan, palatine, coerced, confiscated, unaccountable, immured, prolific, consolidate. Try using one of them in a sentence of your own today. That's it for this one. If this is your first time here, welcome to Bone and Crown. We'll be back soon with another story from history's darker corners. Thank you for listening.